A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
So there is a fascinating conversation coming over this next hour with a guest who is researching human genetics and other issues related to biblical creation. So we're going to be talking today about ancient DNA. Our special guest says biology today is so complex, if Charles Darwin saw it, he'd have a hard time being an evolutionist. Dr. Robert Carter navigated his own in-depth evolutionary training through years at university and emerged with his Christian faith intact. He has taught biology, chemistry, physics and electronics. Before obtaining his PhD in marine biology, Dr. Robert Carter is a senior scientist and speaker for Creation Ministries International. He's based in the US. The office of CMI in the US is in Atlanta, Georgia. His latest DVD is entitled Ancient DNA, and I might say a very special welcome to the studio to you, Robert Carter.
Well, thank you.
Hey, Robert, you're in Australia. This is like a month-long tour, yes. I think, and I'll tell listeners how they can get in touch with you and be a part of some gatherings that you'll be speaking to in Cairns. But I wonder if we might start with Charles Darwin. So many people admire Charles Darwin, and clearly he was a thinking man of science. But as I mentioned in that introduction there, if Charles Darwin was alive today, would he be able to hold the same sorts of concepts? Give us your insight here.
It's really kind of funny because Darwin, being an 19th century gentleman, he knew as much about the science of the day as anyone could know, but they didn't know anything we know today. So evolutionary theory was invented in a vacuum of knowledge. He didn't know what genetics was. He didn't know how traits are passed from one generation to the next. He didn't know what mutations were. He didn't know all these things we know today about the wonders of the technology inside the cell and how complex life is. He depended upon life being simple for evolution to work, and life is not at all simple. So if he were alive today, I don't think he would be able to invent his very simplistic, natural selection can change things over a very long time and get all these new things can develop, because he has to explain where things came from. And complexity doesn't come from random processes.
Because he didn't know all of these modern issues in science, and I can hear what you're saying, and our listeners will be able to appreciate, well, of course, he didn't know what modern science knows today, but was it enough for him to form a theory about evolution?
His hypothesis was that natural selection can lead to grand evolutionary changes. That's what the origin of species was. He promised that he was in the future going to come out with a lot more information to prove all this, to prove his hypothesis, but he never actually could do it because natural selection is not what he needed. Natural selection, all it does is remove things. It gets rid of the unfit. It prevents organisms from reproducing if they don't quite fit the environment very well. That's not a creative process. So he was really struggling a lot, even then, with explaining how so-called evolution could work. But in the biblical model, we have a genius creator God who created life to change and adapt because he's smart.
So what Charles Darwin was able to do was observe that there were some things that might change and form a theory of evolution, as you say, the survival of the fittest. The fittest survive and the weakest are either devoured or die out. But he didn't understand things that we might appreciate today about things like mutation and the way that would have affected different animal species.
Yeah, well, of course, the modern evolutionists, they use mutations. That's called the neo-Darwinian synthesis, when they took natural selection plus mutation. Oh, now we can explain where everything comes from. But again, that doesn't explain the rise of complex structures. Once you have living things, they can change. Great. Our God created living things. Now they can change to some degree. So the question's not, can things change? The question's not, can mutations cause a white bear, we call that a polar bear, or a black bear. That's irrelevant. The question is, where did the bears come from? And can a simple process of mutation plus natural selection create something as complex as what we see inside the cell?
And what you are saying is that modern science should tell us that those things can't happen.
Modern science is, if we apply all the rules of probability and chemistry and information theory to the cell, no, there's nothing out in the natural world that's going to produce a living thing, let alone a complex living thing.
And you say that Charles Darwin was working on a sequel to his book, Origin of the Species,
Yes.
but he couldn't complete it.
He couldn't complete it.
Why do you think he could not ever complete it?
Because he could not find the information that he needed. He said he was going to use 10 model organisms to show how natural selection works on them. And we found the manuscript, not me, but the manuscript was found in his study after he died. He completed multiple other books during that time, but the grand proof of evolution, according to natural selection, was not forthcoming because it wasn't there.
Robert, this is a fascinating conversation, and we're going to get into some great dimensions in our conversation today. But what is it that listeners might need to know about genetics, about the complexity of how things look today to a modern scientist, if we're going to understand a conversation about these genetics and mutations and those sorts of things?
Yeah, the conversation is not going to be, can things change? The conversation is, how complex is life? Because once life is too complex for simplistic Darwinian evolution to explain, then we have to look to an alternate source, and the alternate source is going to be the God of the Bible.
It's funny, isn't it? Because my suspicion is that the reputation that Christians have is that somehow or other we're the ones who are being simplistic. But it seems to be the opposite, because anyone who wants to ascribe to a Darwinian evolution, they're actually the ones who are ascribing to the simplistic. How complex is the design that we talk about when we start to appreciate a creator being involved?
How complex is the design, man. How many people in the listening audience have had a course in biology and struggled because there are so many words to learn? That's only the introduction. The deeper you go in biology, the more things there are to learn, and it never ends. There's so much complexity, so much amazing details, so much, feedback loops and all sorts of interactions of different cellular components, and nothing in the cell is independent of anything else. All the parts have to work together. It's like a system. God didn't create a living thing. He created systems within living things that all interact with each other and build on each other in order for life to work. It's this higher level complexity stuff that's hard for the human brain even to understand. That's what living things are. It's the opposite of the life is really simple and we can just change willy-nilly and natural selection can be applied and now you can have butterflies evolve from caterpillars or something like that. No, these are hard things to overcome. And even at the most basic parts of the evolutionary tree, one of the first evolutionary organisms in their model to ever evolve was a blue-green alga. But they're photosynthetic. The earliest organisms that anyone can see in the evolutionary model, now I don't believe the evolutionary model, but in their model, are photosynthetic organisms. But photosynthesis is the most improbable set of chemical reactions that anyone could imagine. Those chemicals that are capturing the light beams, it's like a butterfly trying to capture a cannonball. Those photons from the light destroy the biological molecules. And so the biological molecule captures a photon and instantly hands it off to another one so it doesn't get destroyed. And that one hands it off to another one so it doesn't get destroyed. And each time they hand it off, they take a little bit of energy and they're able to make energy for the cell. But you're talking about thousands of genes, thousands of proteins, all in this very delicately balanced, elegant, sort of like a dance of molecules. And that's at the base of the tree of life? That's not simple, that's complex. So the complexity of life is what's arguing against Darwinian evolution. It always has.
The complexity, and coming back to this thought that Christians are the ones who are considered to be simplistic in our approach, saying God is the creator. But when you begin to describe that, and just this complexity of photosynthesis, as you just did, sometimes people will even make a reference to things like a simple cell.
Oh, yes, a simple cell.
Now, give us a little insight here, as someone who is a biologist, an expert in this field. How complex is that simple cell?
The simplest possible life form has to be able to maintain a difference between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell, or life can't happen. So they need a membrane. They need pores in the membrane that can let ions in and out. This organism is going to have to take molecules and break them apart and harvest the energy. That's like trying to harvest energy out of a fire. How do you do that? Fires consume everything, but no, the organisms can take a sugar molecule, say, break it in half, take a little bit of energy and use that to do all these other cellular things, which is going to include at least hundreds of proteins that already have to be present, and all the systems have to be present. And that's even assuming it can get what it needs from the outside. But what warm little pond in Darwin's concept is going to have all the parts that the cell needs? And that cell's also going to have to be able to reproduce. Could you imagine if there was a factory with a bunch of robots that was designed to make another factory with a bunch of robots and in order to reproduce itself? I mean, how much complexity would be required? How many systems how much intelligent design would have to go into the development of that factory, and how much thought and how much money and how much technology just to build a simple factory that reproduces itself? Life is more complex even than that.
I'm sure there are a lot of people who are hoping that AI might get some level of science interactions to that sort of level. I like a terminology that you use if you're describing the complexity. You say that there is a spaghettification of irreducible complexity. You better explain that for us.
Well, Michael Behe and other people in the intelligent design community, they gave us the phrase specified complexity, which is, or irreducible complexity, I should say. This is, you have a thing like a mousetrap and only has a few parts, but each one has to be exactly right, or the mousetrap doesn't function. Well, life is a lot more complex than just that. So if you wanted to produce like, let's say the motor in our cells that produces energy, makes ATP. Well, that motor is based on proteins, but the proteins have to be coded in the DNA. And that DNA has to be maintained, which requires hundreds of other proteins just to maintain the DNA, which are also coded in the DNA. But a protein, from the DNA, it has to be transcribed into RNA, which requires a whole set of proteins and RNAs, and then that has to be made into the protein, but all those steps also require ATP. So in order to make the ATP motor, the thing that makes the ATP, you need thousands of other things that use up ATP to be produced. So what came first? The information for the ATP motor in the DNA, the ability to maintain the DNA, the ability to make the RNA, the ability to make the proteins, to modify the proteins, to assemble that motor to make the ATP. You're talking about, hundreds if not thousands of levels of using ATP in order to make ATP. So this is not something that's going to evolve. This is God putting all the components of a cell together, orchestrating them, putting them in the right place, putting exactly the right amount of nutrients and the right pH and all these things, and then letting go. And it works. Such a system doesn't arise from naturalistic, random processes.
So if you're in this debate, evolution versus creation, you're really in accidental versus intentional.
Yeah,
the design of a creator in the complexity is an absolute necessity. How do you describe that for people who are, no doubt you're talking to people all the time who are skeptics, and they want to be skeptics because they find it very hard to accept that there is a divine creator who created the heavens and the earth and people like us. How do you describe that? Is there a simple way of just being able to say, wait a minute, you're talking accidental, I'm talking intentional, and this is why I need to talk about intentional?
Yes, and this is why we love to talk about complexity. Because when you look at the complexity of the cell, it demands that an outside agent created the cell. Probability says it's not going to happen by itself. Chemistry says it's not going to happen by itself. We need a God who's outside of time and space in order to create life. He is an all-sufficient cause. He's also a necessary component of biology.
This is 2020 with Neil Johnson, helping you make sense of life, culture, and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision Christian Radio.
Well, our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. You might like to join us in the conversation. It is no holds barred. You might have the hardest question. You might be thinking, I've got a question, surely no one can answer that. Well, you might like to put our guest through his paces today. Dr. Robert Carter is our guest, senior scientist and speaker with Creation Ministries International. He's in Australia, a visit this month. And I'll give you the details of that tour arrangements again very shortly. But 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation. When we're talking genetics and ancient DNA, that takes us back to, Adam and Eve. Is there evidence that there was one man and one woman at the beginning, that God created just the way Genesis said? How do you describe, taking us back through the ages to common people?
It's really funny because the Bible demands that there is one woman and one male ancestor of everyone on earth today. That's a basic biblical demand based on the history of Genesis. Evolution does not require that. They could have any number of people, it wouldn't matter. Well, when they started looking at the data, 30, 40 years ago, they said, wait a minute. There's only one woman ancestor, and a little while later it said, oh wait, there's only one male ancestor? Yeah, so they discovered our Adam and Eve for us, even though they didn't have to. Now after they just started discovering Adam and Eve, they kind of waved their little magic wands, say, oh no, these aren't the first people ever. They're just two random people in a small population several 100,000 years ago in Africa, and it just so happens that at just luck and chance, they happened to be the male or female ancestor of everyone else alive today. So the Bible says there should be an Adam and Eve, and there is an Adam and Eve. And I love that about history.
Well, there might be listeners who want to explore that a little deeper, and you'll be able to. So 1-800-316-316, let's take some calls. Sam is calling through, and a question about animals mutating. Hey, Sam, welcome.
Hello, how are you?
Good. Sam, ask your question.
I'm just inquiring about cats in the wild. Have they mutated? Because if there's no evolution, then the cats must have mutated. Because they're very wild and savage, and you can catch any of them. They're nothing like the rest of cats.
Fabulous question, Sam. Difference between a domestic cat and what we might all think of as a feral cat, cats in the wild. What are your thoughts here, Robert?
It is genetically kind of obvious that domestic cats came from wild cats. That we calm them down, even though they're not really calm. A cat is still a little lion, and it knows it. But the wild cats across the world are pretty ferocious little things, but they had to be to survive in the post-flood world. The world today is a lot different than it was when God created it. And the organisms that weren't more aggressive, well, most of them just got eaten. And so we have cats, but mutation still happens. I mean, evolution might not be true in the grand scale, but it doesn't mean that things don't change over time. It doesn't mean that lions and tigers and jaguars didn't derive from some original cat kind that came off of the ark. I mean, there's a lot of potential changes that are possible in a God-created universe. A lot of changes. I mean, there's so some groups of organisms, there's like 1,000 species. Even some of the corals here in the Great Barrier Reef, there's hundreds of species in one genus. Well, that's God-created diversity, and as these things are reproducing and sexually recombining over time, you get different species popping up. But the process of mutation plus sexual selection plus, just time, you can get a lot of diversification.
But you're not likely to get corals becoming cats.
That's right.
Yeah. So,
yes,
so
good point.
Within the species, the little cats and big cats, they're all cats.
They're all cats. They're very cat-like. They have a lot of similarities. In fact, when we look at what can reproduce with which species can reproduce? Well, all the big cats can interbreed, the lions and the tigers and whatnot, and they can interbreed with the slightly smaller cats, and they can interbreed with the smaller cats, and they can interbreed with like the lynxes, and the lynxes can interbreed with the wild cats, and the wild cats can interbreed with house cats. There's one giant chain of connectivity amongst all the cats in the world as far as we can tell. So they really do look like they're one created kind. And then diversification happened after Noah's flood as they spread out. You have little populations of cats carrying only a few of the genes of the total, so they look a little different. And then you put mutation on top of that, and you might get, this type of tiger versus another type of tiger in its coat color patterns or something like that.
Sam, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Also, I'd like to ask, with blood being found in the bones of dinosaurs, can we use that for an elephant to be crossbred with them?
Okay, so the bones of dinosaurs, could you use that to crossbreed with, say, an elephant? Nice quick one on this one.
Okay. We are able to pull DNA out of some very old organisms. Now, these are early post-flood organisms in my world, but the evolution is saying, oh, no, this woolly mammoth is 300,000 years old or something when it got buried. And we're now able to pull DNA out of those things. That DNA is not supposed to exist. If the world is really as old as they think, DNA should not be there, and yet we keep on finding it in supposedly older and older and older specimens. There is evidence of non-petrified material in some dinosaur bones. There is chemical evidence that there's DNA in some dinosaur bones. No one has yet cloned that DNA. Someone eventually, I believe, will. But it doesn't mean that you're ever going to get a living dinosaur, because the DNA in those bones is really fragmented. It's broken up. It's in little teeny pieces. There's no, you can't take a cell out of a dinosaur bone and stick it in a reptile and have it turn into a grown dinosaur.
Sam, thank you so much for your call. 1-800-316-316 to join our conversation. Let's take some more calls. Kay is in Maroochydore in Queensland. Hey, Kay, welcome.
Hello. I'm interested in asking your speaker, and thank you very much for your information and everything. Really good.
You're welcome, Kay.
I have grandchildren that are in their young age, age 7 to 4 year old, and I would like to they get gifts like dinosaurs, carry around dinosaurs, and I'd like to talk to them or get a book or something, a suitable book for their age about creation and dinosaurs. Is that possible? Or
Okay, that is a wonderful question, and the answer is absolutely. Just go to creation.com and click on the store and look around. You'll find dinosaur books, some technical ones, and some children's-based dinosaur books.
Children books, right?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
We also have articles and some videos on dinosaurs that just right there on creation.com. Tons of great information for you, and I think we got your back on that one.
Creation.com.
Yes, ma'am.
Creation.com. Kay, thank you so much for your call. And when it comes to these sorts of things too, Creation.com, more than 10,000 searchable articles on all sorts of different aspects of creation and evolution. You can check that out, Creation.com. Let's take another call. Grant is in Perth, WA. Hey, Grant, welcome.
Oh, welcome, guys. How are you going this morning?
Doing good, thanks, Grant.
Doing great.
That's excellent. Yeah, I just wanted to just jump on the Charles Darwin thing. I've got a couple of points here that I would like to get your opinion.
Need to be quick.
He's I reckon God gave him such a good gift that if he was here today, he would have adapted, and God would have enhanced that for him. So that's just that quick one. But just on that dinosaur thing, if I could ask the guest, all those dinosaurs for billions of years put on this planet for all our resources, like the fuels, the oils that have gone down to the bottom of the ocean, the old fish that have died. So I kind of think that is a really good thing that God's done so we could survive on this planet. And
okay, so I think there's a number of questions in there. Did you pick up, Charles Darwin would have adapted? Is there a quick response there?
Yeah, Charles Darwin, if he were alive today, would probably be a Gaia conspiracist, someone who thinks that the universe is kind of alive and natural things, complexity just naturally arises out of the fabric of the universe. Or maybe he's someone who believes that aliens created life. So he would have adapted. He would have changed. He wouldn't have had this very simplistic idea. He would have understood something else has to be true. But when you start talking about aliens, that's called intelligent design. When you're talking about Gaia, that's metaphysics. I mean, this is no longer simple science anymore.
Good speculation about what Charles Darwin would believe today. The other point was about animals that decompose and find their way to the bottom of the ocean, and along the lines of, and I hope I've got this right, Grant, along the lines of forming things like other resources, like oil.
Oils and stuff that we use today and drill for.
Yeah, for a long time I was a little skeptical of the evolutionary story of oil formation, but after learning a lot and reading more and more and more, it's pretty clear that it's derived biologically. It doesn't come up from the center of the earth, and there's a lot of chemical signatures suggesting that this is a lot of it is derived from algae, marine algae. So in order to explain the presence of oil, we need the burial of a lot of organic material during Noah's flood that has to then decompose under the heat and the pressure. I think we can do it. It doesn't take millions of years to form things like oil, but you do have to have a lot of carbon buried very quickly. And Noah's flood actually gives a good recipe for that, because you have a lot of things happening geologically, a lot of sedimentation happening, and then you have things that are buried deep. And therefore, this is probably the origin of oil.
Let's continue to take some calls. Let's hear from James in Kyabram in Victoria. Hey, James, welcome.
Hey, Neil. G'day, Speaker. I've never been a declared evolutionist, but about 35, 40 years ago, God challenged me with a question to tie up some loose ends. He said, well, how did the fruit evolve? And, of course, I'm reading from the English Revised Version. It says, and God said, behold, I've given you every herb-yielding seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in the which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed, to you it shall be for meat. And, of course, there we have seeds, which in some cases you can't just put the seed in the ground. They have to be grafted in. So it takes the hands of a man to do that, because none of the animals have, besides the apes, but we don't see them grafting trees in today. So what I'm saying is I wasn't a skeptic so much, but I think that skeptics out there need to be challenged with that same thought that I got 35, 40 years ago. How did the fruit evolve? Did we evolve to eat the type of fruit that was growing? How did that come out of the explosion of the thing of the sun? Like that was what we were taught at school. They were trying to feed our minds. So
James, great question here. Let's come to Robert. Fruit, evolution. What are your thoughts here, Robert?
Yeah, actually, in the evolutionary worldview, there is a massive mystery. And it's the rise of what are called the angiosperms. Those are the things that we mostly eat. Fruit trees, maple trees, all sorts of flowering plants is what it is. And flowering plants just explode. There they are in the fossil record, and in a huge bewildering array with no evolutionary precursors. And this has been known for a long time. So yeah, the rise of fruit, or I would say fruit trees or angiosperms, if you want to be real technical, is a massive mystery for them. For us, God created them. God created oak trees. In fact, he probably created white oaks and red oaks and let them speciate after that. Or he may have just created oaks and then the white oaks and red oaks speciated from some ancient oak population. But he created trees and their amazing ability to reproduce with pollen and with fruit production and their seeds. And yeah, there are some things that require careful cultivation. There are most things, though, they do reproduce on their own, and they might use a bat to, fertilize, or an animal to spread the seeds around. But there are a few things that require cultivation by humans. Not many.
James, does that answer your question?
Well, mine wasn't really a question. Mine was to stimulate the mind of somebody who was sceptical, because I'm not a skeptic. I never declared myself.
Yes, good
but
point.
I appreciate what you're saying. I'm hoping I can get to the meeting in Victoria. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Fabulous stuff. Thanks so much to James in Kyabram.
The ability of a plant to reproduce is actually crazy complicated. When a little pollen lands on the flower, a lot of really strange things happen. It's this dance of amazing cellular processes and things growing and fusing and splitting, and then the end result is a large, for a fruit that is You have little seeds inside a big thing that's designed for something else to eat it on purpose. Because if something didn't eat it, the seeds wouldn't get spread around. So it's like God created this system to work really, really, really well. But the system, again, is super complicated. And that's what belies the thought that it evolved by itself, is how complex sexual reproduction in plants actually is.
So next time you're about to bite into an apple, or you're cutting up that fruit for the kids, this is actually a demonstration of God's creation, because evolution doesn't have an answer there.
Yeah, excellent point. Excellent point.
1-800-316-316 to join our conversation. Let's take another call. Hugo. Welcome along, Hugo. Hello, Hugo, are you with us? Hugo.
Yes, hello.
Hooray.
I could tell you were there. What are your thoughts?
Well, I was watching South Park the other night, and so it's only a cartoon, but I wanted to ask if it's real. And so there was this frog, and it started with a fish, actually, and that fish had retard baby fish that laid other retard baby fish that turned into frogs. And then those frogs ended up falling out of the water. The frogs ended up having sex with a squirrel, which had butt sex with another squirrel that turned into a monkey. And then that monkey had butt sex with another monkey, and that made me.
Okay. All right. So you're talking about fish to monkeys to us.
Yeah, that's a very brief summation of the grand scale evolutionary model. But yeah, you can arrange things in order of complexity like that. You can do it. And in the fossil record, the first things we see in the fossil record are oceanic water-based things. And later on, we have land things. So the evolution says, oh, see that? We evolved onto the land. Well, no, the Noah's flood started in the oceans. That's why the first things buried are things that lived in the oceans. And then it overwhelmed the land, is why the land creatures come later. But the whole evolutionary story of a fish evolving into an amphibian, which evolves into a reptile, which evolves into mammals eventually, has so many massive problems, and it's the major transitions that are the problems. It's the development of brand new technology for the organism, the ability to withstand being in air, the ability to do X, Y, or Z. And those steps are what's missing in the fossil record. It's like when you look at the fossil record, yeah, there's a handful of transitional forms out there that people claim are transitional forms, but the ones they were using 100 years ago are not the ones they're using today. The lifespan of a transitional fossil is usually 10 years on average before it's pushed to the side and ignored. But even granted a handful of possible examples out there, the number of examples should be overwhelming. There should be nothing but transitional fossils everywhere in the fossil record. Because when you're talking about going from one type of organism to a totally different type, that would require a lot of experiments. That would require a lot of false starts. That would require a lot of dead ends. And there should be innumerable, as Darwin said, innumerable transitional forms that must exist, but they don't exist because evolution actually isn't the correct explanation of the history of the world. Is that what you were asking about?
Yeah, it was just a cartoon I watched. Also, one more question quick one is, what is the hardest thing for you to believe in the Bible in regards to creation when you first think about it?
Wow, that's a great, wonderful question. And honestly, I like entertaining those questions. I don't try to run away from things I can't answer. The hardest thing for the biblical creationist community to address is probably starlight and time. How did the light get here from outer space if the universe is only thousands of years old? And that's a wonderful question. However, we have 4 or 5 different models to explain it. And if any one of those models is correct, okay, great, then it's not a problem. And however, the evolutionary model has got all sorts of problems. I mean, the Big Bang is being challenged hugely by new discoveries by our latest space telescopes. And it already had problems conceptually and mathematically and observationally. It's just getting worse. So even though I'm not going to say, here's the answer to starlight and time, they don't have an answer either. No one can explain the origin of the universe. But once you have a God, Once you have an outside creator, all of a sudden you don't have to explain the universe using nothing but physics and time. You have a God who made stuff. And now let's explain how he may have made it.
Hugo, I want to thank you
That's
so
a great
much
question.
for your
Great
call. Yes, a great question. And, the concept that God is complex and that he is able. For some, you got to go back to a starting point. And so God is a starting point. Of course, connecting the God who is the starting point with the God of the Bible means that there are other dimensions too when we're talking about Jesus Christ as creator. When we're talking about God as the creator, the God of the Bible, there's many other dimensions, not just a cognitive appreciation of a science here, because there are experiences and there are the testimonies of people who have experienced the presence of God. Those things are important too, no doubt.
Yeah, definitely. This is not really a science argument. This is a spiritual argument. If there's a God, then there's other things in this universe that science will never, ever be able to address. And if that God can interact with people and change people's hearts and change people's minds, that will influence our approach to science also.
1-800-316-316. If you have a burning question for our special guest, Dr. Robert Carter, let's take another call. Betty is in New South Wales. Hey, Betty, welcome.
Thank you. I have a question. In Genesis, Cain says after he kills Abel that he'd be homeless, and he goes to wandering, and if anyone finds me, they will kill me. So is it possible that God made more than Adam and Eve? He made other people, but they were chosen people, to carry on the species of humanity. Is it possible that God did that, but they died in the flood, and only Adam and Eve's genetics were kept? Is that possible?
Betty, that is a wonderful question. And it's a question we get asked a lot. And it's a multifaceted explanation. We could probably talk for an hour back and forth on just that one question. Scripturally, Adam is the ancestor of everyone who's ever lived. That means no one outside the garden. That's important scripturally and theologically because in Adam we fell. If there were people outside the garden that weren't descended from Adam, they weren't under this curse of God. They wouldn't have needed to be rescued by Christ. So some really deep theological stuff in there. But
they died in the flood. So
hold it.
Adam.
There's more though. There's more. I'm going to encourage you to go to creation.com and look up my article, How Old Was Cain When He Killed Abel? Because that's a great question. If the only time statement in Scripture, after creation, the next thing that any time is mentioned is Adam is 130 years old when Seth is born. And Seth means replacement. So he's the next son born after the murder. There's a 130-year window there for Cain to kill Abel. Cain and Abel could have been great-great-grandparents by this point in time. There could have been many hundreds, if not thousands, of people in the world, depending upon, how fertile females were, back in the day, which we don't know, but there's potentially many hundreds of people. So when Cain is worried, whoever finds me will kill me, it's all his relatives.
Thank you.
And
You're
welcome. He found a wife. Well, it was one of his relatives. He built a city. Okay, fine.
Yes.
These are potentially lots of people.
That you've answered. Thank you very much. I will go into it and study it harder.
You're welcome. Thank you for calling.
Thank you.
Betty,
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for your call. 1-800-316-316. It raises that whole question, doesn't it? So when we start to talk about Adam and Eve, because a lot of people will talk about mitochondrial Eve and a way that you can trace the genetics back to one common woman and, of course, the one common man. But is there a quick explanation for how you can say that Adam and Eve are an obvious fit for how things actually happened?
Not only is there one Y chromosome ancestor of every male alive today, and as any male we've ever found in the ancient DNA record, there's also one female ancestress of all people alive today and all the people we've ever found in the fossil record and pulled their DNA out of. So we've got Adam and Eve right there. But it's not only that. When you look at the genetic diversity of the people on this planet, they can easily fit into Adam and Eve. I mean, easily. It's not a struggle. Now, during Noah's flood, the whole world population was reduced down to only 8 people, and you would lose some of the genetic diversity that was in Adam and Eve there, because that inbreeding event, you're going to lose some genetic diversity. I calculated between 30 and 40 or 50% of Adam and Eve's DNA would be lost. But okay, great. Now we've got, half of Adam's DNA, let's say, in the world population today. Well, people across the planet are really closely related. We're really similar to one another. I mean, the obvious things that separate us are skin color, eye color, hair color, shape of the face, but only that's like this vanishingly small percentage of the genome. I mean, I've got more in common on my Y chromosome with men from Central Africa than other Irish men, because my ancestors comes from Ireland, other Irish men from different branches of the Y chromosome family tree. We're all really closely related, so it's not a struggle to explain genetic diversity, Adam and Eve, or the rise of races. I mean, it just naturally comes out of the biblical story.
And is it too much a stretch to say that the scientists who discovered mitochondrial Eve actually were not creationists?
No, definitely not.
But they actually have confirmed a biblical account in discovering that.
Yes, and then a short time later, other scientists were looking at the mutation rate in the mitochondrial genome, and they said, wow, this thing mutates, every generation, every other generation, maybe even every 10 generations. It doesn't matter. The numbers that they're pulling out for how fast things change that we can measure in families today, if you put that clock onto how long ago mitochondrial Eve lived, she would have only have lived 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. And the same is true when you look at the mutation rate of Y chromosomes from one man to another, to his son, to his grandson, to his great-grandson. Adam would only have lived a few thousand years ago. So the amount of genetic diversity is on our side, Adam and Eve's on our side, and the time it would require to generate all the mutations we see in the population today is also on our side. The genetic data is screaming the Bible's true.
And the reason why our universities continue to pound the evolutionary origins is because they don't want to believe in a creator. Would that be a simple way of saying that?
Being that we are spiritual beings and people are created with a knowledge of God or need for God, they know it. I mean, just using just standard, straight up human psychology and philosophy and whatnot, yeah, they know that a God must exist. We get that in the Bible. People know a God must exist. It doesn't mean they know the name of the God of the Bible. It doesn't mean they understand the role of Christ in redemption, but they understand that there's something else out there. There must be more to life than this, simple chemicals and random things. We are different. There's this like spiritual switch that's thrown inside of us that's not in any other species. I mean, monkeys, they're dumb. They still live in the rainforest. We've flown to the moon. We're the one species that can actually ponder about God and existence. Other species, there's no evidence that they have a philosophical, religious understanding for anything. So we're made to relate to that God. We're made so that we can understand that God. And if your listeners out there saying, I don't know if this God really exists, wait a minute. Biology tells us God must exist. And the only God that can really exist is the God of the Bible, something outside of space and time that created us and loves us and wants us to know him more.
Let's squeeze in one more call. Leonie is calling from, I think it's Cavendish in Victoria. Hello, Leonie. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you, and Dominus people. Number one, I worked out we've got a devolving universe, not an evolving one. And number two, the God that created the universe, you and me, can do anything he wants, except the one thing that he can't do is sin, of course. But if he wants more life on Earth, he'll create it. And on top of that, when you think of all that he has done, then I tell people, look at your carpet. Can you actually count the number of stitches in that carpet? And I get this weird look, why would I bother? And
That's a funny
tell
question.
them that is the same sort, it's less infinity than God has.
Yes, a devolving universe. Thoughts here, Robert?
Yeah, we're definitely in a devolving universe. Things are falling apart. In fact, Carl Wieland, our the forefather, if you want to call him that, of Creation Ministries, wrote a book called World Winding Down. It's available on creation.com. It's a great little book to explain why everything's falling apart. I mean, science tells us as things break down over time. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that systems get messed up over time. You don't get complexity. You actually get a devolution in all sorts of different ways. The universe is slowly crumbling. Life is slowly crumbling. The environment is slowly crumbling. We live in a sin-cursed universe that has a lifespan, a maximum potential lifespan. I don't necessarily know what that is, but clearly things are getting worse over time. The universe is crying out for redemption. It is crying out in some way to be restored. Well, I'm crying out to be restored, and people listening are crying out to be restored. It's hard sometimes to be alive when we realize the implications that our lives are short and troubled and our bodies are falling apart, and we need something else. We need Christ to come, first of all, save us now, but second, so that we can be saved later and live in a universe where there's no death and decay. Now, the laws of science are still going to apply. There'll still be a second law of thermodynamics in heaven. Great. But God is going to spiritually superintend everything, that accidents aren't going to happen, cancer is not going to arise, and there's not going to be the same law of decay that we see in the universe today.
Leonie, does that answer your question?
Oh, definitely. And I always tell people it's ego versus ego.
Say that again, Leonie. I'm sorry, I missed that. Ego. Okay. Well, Leonie, thank you so much for your call. Appreciate you calling in. We've run out of time. Is this a moment when you can reflect? I mean, I know that listeners have been listening and hanging on every word over this hour of conversation. It's just been so informative, Robert. Absolutely amazing.
I hope so.
Is this a time for some sort of revolution in our schools and in our universities, the sorts of curriculum that is left out? People are not teaching a creation, biblical Genesis formation of all things, because they don't want God. But is this a time for a revolution of bringing new curriculum into our classrooms?
I would love it to be, but the secular establishment has got a stranglehold on education in a lot of different ways. They're not going to let, as Lewontin said, a divine foot in the door. But this revolution starts in the heart. It starts with the individual. It starts with a relationship with Christ first. And then that individual can hopefully be used by God to advance his kingdom on this earth as they go about their daily lives and, share about love and share about science and share about the Bible. But I don't know, I'm trying not to be a Debbie Downer about, let's take over the world systems. And I don't think it's going to happen, because this is a spiritual battle. And it's a giant spiritual battle. And Christianity is not going to be 100% of the religion prior to Christ coming back. So yeah, we have to fight the good fight. And we got to push, and we got to hold their feet to the fire. And there's a lot that we can do and advocate and write letters to editors and speak at school boards and all sorts of things like that. But I'm not expecting that the whole world is to come to Christ prior to the second coming.
But in the meantime, if you're a parent and you're looking to teach your children, there are some tremendous resources available. And I'll give that website, creation.com. Creation Ministries International, a large worldwide ministry. And our special guest today, Dr. Robert Carter. He's based in the US office of CMI, Creation Ministries International, based in Atlanta, Georgia. And he's in Australia, and there's going to be a whole lot of meetings through the month of October. Tomorrow night, he's in Cairns at Cairns South Baptist Church. On Saturday night at Destiny Church in Atherton, on Sunday at Cairns Family Church in Warree, and he's heading to Victoria next week. And beyond those few that I've got mentioned there, you'll need to check the creation.com website to find the events tab and find out the dates to hear this amazing speaker, Dr. Robert Carter, who's visiting Australia. You might want to just get a hold of those dates. Have a look and find out where he is speaking at creation.com. Robert, thank you so much for taking some time to share your thoughts with us. It's just been amazing. Appreciate it, and let's do this again sometime soon.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.